Welcome back, class. This is semester number 2, lesson number 8, and our aim today is how did President Theodore Roosevelt expand the powers of the executive branch? Remember, the executive branch is one of three branches of the federal government, along with the legislative and the judicial. All right. The legislative makes the laws, that's Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. The judicial judges the legality of the laws, right? Declares laws constitutional or unconstitutional. And the executive branch, which is the president and his people, carry out the laws. All right. And our do now today is asking, why is preserving the environment important? And we'll get to that in a second of why that's so important. But just think for a second why it's so important that we have our national parks, our endangered species, our limits on pollution, all that stuff. So we're going to start off by talking about Theodore Roosevelt. All right. And this whole lesson is going to be about Theodore Roosevelt and the square deal. Now, when we talk about the square deal, that is really what you're going to see on the regions when it comes to Teddy Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, sometimes he's called Teddy Roosevelt. But there's a lot you need to know about Theodore Roosevelt. He's one of the most influential presidents in history. And if, in case you were wondering, how important he was, if you look at Mount Rushmore, he's one of four presidents on Mount Rushmore, right? So he's pretty important. On the top left, you have a picture that comes up on the regions from time to time, which shows, him dealing with business. One of the things he dealt with a lot was business, and we're going to talk about that among other things. Theodore Roosevelt was the 26th president of the United States. He believed the president had any powers not specifically denied to the executive in the Constitution. His administration was often known as the Square Deal because of his reforms. So Teddy Roosevelt was a guy who he felt that if it didn't specifically say in the Constitution that it wasn't a power of the president, he could do it. And I want you to make sure you understand 100%, very important, you understand all four of the squares on the right, the Square Deal. Basically, his reforms or his changes came in four different areas of, you know, need. Consumer protection, protecting the buyers of certain things. Regulating business, making sure businesses did not take advantage of the consumer. Labor conditions, making sure that people were being treated right in the workforce. And the last one is conservation, making sure the environment was taken care of. So these are the four things we're going to talk about today, and these are the four things that define Teddy Roosevelt as a president. The first thing we're going to talk about is consumer protection. His influence helped legislate protecting the consumers. And two ways in which he helped push this forward was the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. All right. Between him and the person we learned about last week, Upton Sinclair, they helped to push forward the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act to ensure that the food and the medication that people were getting was, okay to be consumed and wasn't going to be harmful to them. It's very important that he pushed this stuff along because today, and think about it, when we go and buy something, we want to make sure that the stuff we're buying is safe for us to consume. Teddy Roosevelt also regulated business. All right, he strengthened railroad legislation. He regulated shipping rates to protect consumers. He wanted to ensure that consumers weren't taken advantage of by the railroad and the railroad shipping costs. And he was also known as a trust buster. All right, think about a trust as kind of like a monopoly. Right, we learned about that when we learned about monopolies. Monopolies are usually bad because they hurt the consumer. Right, if a monopoly exists, that means the consumer is paying more money because there's no competition. However, he saw the difference between a good trust and a bad trust. All right. He got rid of bad trusts or bad monopolies that hurt the people. I want you to think about Rockefeller. All right. Rockefeller was an example of a bad trust. He had complete control over the market. If another competitor came in and started selling his oil for less money, Rockefeller would undercut the competitor. He would charge less money for the oil. The competitor would go out of business, and then Rockefeller would jack his rates up, and it would hurt the people. But there are also good trusts, such as the electric company and the subways and things like that, stuff we talked about. Labor conditions. He also wanted to make sure he was protecting the worker. He achieved reforms in working conditions. He got the workers shorter hours, higher wages, and employer liability for injuries on the job. So I want you to think about who protected the worker, the labor unions. All right. He worked with the labor unions to guarantee shorter hours, higher wages, employer liability, all of those things. All right. So as we continue to talk about Theodore Roosevelt, I want you to think, how did the people feel about him based on what you're seeing here? And the last thing we're going to look at is conservation. Roosevelt wanted to protect the environment and wilderness. The Forest Reserve Act, the National Reclamation Act built dams and irrigation systems. This was all um, to ensure that we conserved land in the United States, and a lot of the national parks we have today are thanks to Teddy Roosevelt. And he was an avid hunter. He loved hunting. He was an outdoorsman. All right. However, that's part of nature to him, and he didn't want it all to be built up and gotten rid of. Our check for understanding today asks, which action was taken by President Theodore Roosevelt's administration? A. Forcing Southern states to eliminate Jim Crow laws. B. Setting aside land for national forests and water projects. C. Refusing to intervene in Latin American affairs. Or D. Using federal troops to break illegal strikes. And the correct answer is B. Setting aside land for national forests and water projects. Roosevelt loved nature and the wilderness and wanted to protect America's forests. So before we end today, I just wanted to point out one thing. We're going to do some multiple choice in class on this. I want you to look at the way we should be approaching multiple choice. And a lot of you do this from what I've seen. Make sure we're underlining boxing, use the methods you learned last year in global, and eliminate answers. All right, eliminating choices and looking for keywords are very important. If you can at least eliminate two choices, which you should be able to on every region's question, then you have a 50-50 shot of getting it right. Have a nice day.